Welcome to the I Made a podcast, where we hear from podcasters about what they've learned since starting their own show, so you can do the same. And now, here's your host, Chris Creary.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of I Made a Podcast. And for those here for the first time, welcome. My name is Chris Creary, and I'm glad that you're here. This podcast is the absolute best place to learn how your favorite podcasters do their thing and create content on a regular basis. So this podcast is found on all of the major podcasting apps. It's on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you listen to podcasts. All you need to do is just search I Made a Podcast, and I'm sure that you will find it. Now, today, I'm speaking with Erin Harrigan, and she is doing a sensational job with her podcast. She is crushing it. Now, during this conversation with her, she actually went through her entire funnel and explained how she uses her podcast to generate revenue for her business. And the way that she explained it was so easily and transferable to other podcasts or other industries as well. But before we get into this episode with Erin, if you want to take your podcasting to the next level, download my cheat sheet. This is where you will get a list of the best resources that you can use for your podcast, and you can have a successful podcast with great sound and audio. And the secret is some of these apps on this list are free, or they have a free portion to them, so you can actually use them without actually spending a dime. So go get my cheat sheet. It's in the description, and you can work on having a great sounding podcast without sinking $1 million into your production. So anyways, the link for that is in the description. But let's get into this episode with Erin. It was packed full of insight and wonderful things, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So let's get into this interview with Erin right now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of I Made a Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Erin Harrigan. Erin, how are you today?
I am fantastic. It's so good to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm really excited about having this conversation with you and about your podcast. So can you take a moment and introduce yourself to everyone listening and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your podcast?
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Erin Harrigan. I hail from the state of Maryland. I'm a Christian wife, mom, love tacos and the beach and red wine and Broadway tunes. And I am a Christian business coach. I work specifically in the intersection of biblical truth and business acumen for high achieving Christian women, either in their own established business or those who have been in a professional role and are looking to transition potentially into their own business or a new level of leadership. And my podcast is called Redefining Hustle, Pursuing Success as a Christian Woman. It started in February of 2019. It used to be called the Hustle with Heart podcast, because that really was the theme that the Lord had given me when he moved me into coaching in 2018. And it really has become the go-to place for Christian women who have had success and all the outward evidence of success, but internally they're unfulfilled and empty. And they're kind of going, like, I know that God gave me this to do, but what is missing? And what's missing is letting the Lord lead. And so the podcast is a quick 15 minutes on various topics. It could be mindset. It could be tools. It's not, the nuts and bolts of business per se, but it really is for those who have been in business for a little while or who have been in the professional world for a while. And I like to say that we bring biblical truth into practical action in 15 minutes. And the podcast, as I said, has been around for 5 years. So it has been a labor of love. But that said, I truly do love doing it.
That is so awesome. Now, you said so much there that I want to kind of crack open a little bit more. So, well, first of all, so you said your episodes are about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
How frequent are your episodes?
So I do weekly episodes, and most of my episodes are solo, but I do occasionally have guests. So I've had a few guests this year. In June, I'm doing a series that I'll have 3 guests in a row, but it's weekly. It always drops Monday mornings at 6 a.m.
Wonderful. Nice. And one of the things that I really love, and I, being a Christian as well, I study the Bible and do my devotions, and I find that there are so many practical principles from the Bible that can apply to business, that if you study them out, you can actually get those principles and apply them into business. So I love your tagline there where you said taking biblical truths and applying them to practical business. I think I butchered it. What was that
Okay.
tagline that you mentioned?
Applying biblical truths to business with
Right.
practical application, because I
Absolutely.
believe like we've got to have an action plan, right? So I always give at least one or two things like, okay, so here's how you apply this.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. Not only
Yeah.
with business, but like Christianity in general, you have to be able to understand how to apply the scriptures.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, Christians and just people in general, they miss out on those practical things. And I think Christians miss the mark when they get into business and they think that the Bible can't really help them, right?
Yeah.
But if you read the Bible and you study and you pull out those practical, I mean, just look at the law of sowing and reaping,
Exactly.
right? Simple example, right? In your business, you need to be able to put some inputs, sow some seeds for your business, and then work it, and then eventually you will see the harvest of those fruits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love the fact that that is, straight from the Bible. And once you pull out those principles, you can apply them into your business, and over the course of time, you will see the fruits from it. So I
Absolutely.
absolutely love your podcast. So you mentioned at the beginning when you were introducing what your podcast is and what it's about, that the name was called Hustle with Heart. And I
Yes.
went back and I listened to your first episode, and I listened. So usually what I do is I listen to, when I'm interviewing anyone, I listen to the first episode and I listen to their most recent episode.
Yeah.
I noticed a huge change in terms of like audio quality.
Yeah.
You got so much better from the first episode, but can you take us back to that first episode when you were given your story, and
Yeah.
maybe let us know why you got into this podcast or decided to start this podcast and this theme of understanding business from a biblical perspective?
Sure. So I was working with a coach in 2018. Well, let me back up. So my story in a nutshell is I've been a driver, striver, and achievement chaser my whole life. I like to think that my story is this ambitious woman got lost on the way to the top. She found Jesus. He said, "Why don't you let me drive and you hold this map," which is the Bible. And then after some driving and him taking some exits I wasn't expecting, and after him really pruning away self-sufficiency and self-reliance and pride and idolatry, he said, "Okay, now I want you to go share this with my ambitious daughters." And that's where my coaching business began. I was working then with a coach in 2018 as I was getting off the ground, and I had all of this content, all of these lessons, all of the ways that the Lord had shown me what it meant to pursue success with him versus pursuing success the way I always had. And the first thing that she said was, "You need to do a podcast." And I thought, no, I don't know anything about podcasting. But what appealed to me about that, number one, is that I had at the time I had a multi-level marketing or a network marketing business with a wellness company. And they always taught us that your car was a rolling university. So I listened to podcasts all the time. And as a busy mom, I knew I had 15 to 20 minutes to really absorb that information. And so I loved the media and the medium of podcasting. I loved that people who did it right would get right to the point and give me an action so that I could take it and apply that. So the idea of podcasting was really interesting to me, and that's where it started. The title Hustle with Heart came out of what the Lord was bringing me through and to begin delivering through coaching, speaking, writing, helping entrepreneurs align results to God's truth, heart. And so I named it the Hustle with Heart podcast. And so it started in February 2019. I had earbuds, right, with a cord, with the built-in micro. I mean, that's why it sounded the way it did. I started using Zoom for my podcast, which sometimes I still do, although now I use StreamYard a little bit more. So it was pretty primitive. But what I loved about that, and I still love about that, is anybody can start a podcast. You know,
Yes.
you don't have to have all the professional equipment to get started. And so often we allow those outside things to stop us when we have a message, whatever that message is, and we're not getting it into the world because we're worried about, having an ATR, whatever microphone I have.
Yeah, and I love where you're taking this conversation, because most of the people who I speak to who don't have a podcast yet, they get hung up over the things that they don't have, the microphone, the
Yes.
camera, the this and this and the that, and they can't do this. But if you think about it, if you have a smartphone, you have pretty much
Absolutely.
all that you need. So,
Right.
and like you mentioned, you have a message. We all have something inside of us that we can use to encourage someone else, to help someone else, or even through situations that we have been through. If we record that and put it out there, it can be an encouragement to
Mhm.
someone else out there, even if it's one person. I always said about my other podcast, the Faith Fight podcast, and I do that, and I pray to God. I said, God, I will do that podcast as long as people are listening, right? So when
Right.
I see the downloads go to zero, right, consistently for a period of time, I'd be like, okay, God, I guess you're saying it's time for
It's
me
done.
to stop.
Right.
But the thing is, every episode that I have done, I've always seen a lot of downloads, and which tells me that it's blessing somebody,
Yeah.
right? But if I had gotten caught up over, oh, I don't have this or I don't have that, I can't start, the message and the things that were inside of me would never get out and help anybody,
That's right. That's right.
right?
And you don't know who you're impacting, right? And regardless of what you're speaking on, that message is in you for a reason. And what's at stake if you don't put that message out is who will not have the opportunity to experience your message, and perhaps that's the transformation. That's where the transformation starts. You
Yes.
just never know.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love this insight that you're sharing right now. And I hope that whoever's listening right now will be encouraged to start their podcast. Now, let's talk about your podcast now. So, you've been doing it since 2019, right? So, you have quite a few episodes already.
Yeah.
Now, your memory might be a little bit hazy when it comes to answering this question, but I'm sure you'll be able to give me something. Can you tell me what was the best episode that you've ever did, or the most impactful episode that you have ever recorded by yourself, either a solo episode or interview that you have done with someone else?
Yeah. If I'm thinking back over the hundreds and hundreds of episodes, which not all of my episodes are numbered. So I have probably 400 episodes, but I've only
Wow.
numbered, up to 250 something. I think the most impactful episode, well, anytime I speak on something that I'm walking through in that moment
Hmm.
and the lesson that I'm learning, that's always impactful. When in the fall of 2022, some incredibly trusted peers pointed out to me that I seem to be continuing to lean into this idea that the hustle is not bad. It's how we define it and it's how we
Hmm.
pursue it. That they encouraged me, you can plant your flag in that. Like, yes, hustle with heart, like that's great. But we think it would be really powerful if you planted your flag as being the person who talked about how do we redefine hustle. And so those episodes, I would say from probably November through the end, or the November 2022 to the beginning of 2023, are some of the most powerful, because that's when I made the shift and I changed the name and all of those pieces. And that's what I was walking through at the time as a high achiever. Was I like the movement of business and being active. You could call that hustle. The challenge is that the world tends to define hustle in a really negative, frantic, aggressive way.
Yes.
And what I've realized through a couple of books that I've read about Jesus's journey and the work that he did is that while it doesn't say hustle in the Bible anywhere, we do know that Jesus was busy. We know that he served big and small audiences. We know that he always sought his Father, and we know that he was never hurried. And so
Yes.
if that is an example or a model of hustle, that's what I want to do. And so those episodes really, I think, were the most impactful. Anytime I get really vulnerable and I share something that I'm going through, the downloads really spike, because I think Chris, that people just want to hear that they're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of my favorite episodes that I've done.
Wonderful. Excellent. And I love the way that you kind of went over and you bring up Jesus's life. And the one thing that actually came as some insight for me recently was the fact that Jesus never was in a hurry. He never
Right.
rushed.
No.
If you study his life, he never rushed. And so, confession time for me, when it comes to the word hustle, and you mentioned it a little bit, I hated using that word because of the way that the world used
Yes.
it, right?
Yeah.
If you want your business to succeed, you got to hustle. Don't sleep. Don't eat properly. Go do this. Go do that. Don't do this. Blah, blah, blah. Just business, business, business. Go, 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 go. And I hated that because it's not real. Like you will burn out that way,
Amen.
right? And what I and I so I tend not to use that word hustle for that reason. But the way that you put it in that perspective is, the way that Jesus lived his life, understanding purpose and
Yeah.
doing what he needed to do at that specific time,
That's
right? If
Mhm.
and the reason why I love the way that you put it is because when you first identify what you are called to do, you could
That's
then
right.
focus in on that one specific thing
Yes.
versus the way that the world see it as hustling. You're going out there and you're doing everything you can at every
That's
single
right.
moment to get it, whatever you can out of those results. And whether they're effective or not, who knows? But
Right.
I don't think that's effective when it comes to business, right? My
Yeah.
thing with life and everything, especially in business, is I want to make sure that make sure that I am efficient, right?
Mhm.
The work that I'm putting in, am I getting the best possible results out of it?
And Chris, the other thing that I was saying or I was seeing at the time was this whole movement to anti-hustle. And I thought, well, I don't really relate to that because in my mind, anti-hustle is like, slow down, chill, right? Like, okay, that's fine. But the women and the audience that I serve, which mainly is women, but certainly I have men, and thank you for being one of those that listens to my podcast, that we do operate in action and we are fueled and empowered by the Holy Spirit to step, to move. And so I didn't relate. It was like this pendulum, right? It was like hustle till your haters ask if you're hiring, right? And then the pendulum swings to anti-hustle. And I thought, no, wait a minute. We can meet in the middle. And one thing that you said, which feels so key, is getting clear on whom you serve or how you serve them or what that one thing is. Because I think you're right that the reason that is so pervasive in our society is because, we're expected to be everywhere
Mhm.
all the time, always on, available, etc. And Jesus didn't do that. I mean, even when, he was becoming pretty popular and the disciples are like, hey, let's set up a stage and do more over here. And he was like, nah, I think I'm going to go talk to my father, right? Because he knew he worked with intention and purpose. And we can do that. We can do that. And our businesses will go so much further.
Excellent. Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful insight. And okay, so for everyone listening out there, I'm going to put all of the links for Erin's podcast in the description of this episode. So you can go down, and this is the type of insight that you can get through Erin's podcast when you go and you listen to it. Now, Erin, you also mentioned earlier that you have a coaching part or coaching business that is related to what you do with your podcast. Can you share with us how those two work together?
Sure. So one of the things that I got clear on in probably 2022, maybe the beginning of 2022, is I began to take a look at where do my clients come from. So the Lord had called me into coaching in 2018, and I've been doing customized coaching since then. And at the beginning, which is this is one of the things that also I believe really stalls us because we get very distracted by it. I thought I had to be in all the places. I have to be posting on Facebook and posting on Instagram and everywhere. But I took a look at historically, where did my clients come from? What were those client referral sources? And what I identified at the time, Chris, was one that 80% of my clients come from personal referral. Someone knows me, someone referred me, etc. But 20% of those were coming from people hearing me as a guest on a podcast or my own podcast. And so that's when I really decided, you know what, I'm going to double down on this podcast, meaning let me get really clear. What are the topics? What are the keywords, et cetera, that people are using to search for my podcast so that I could really focus my content? Because what I understood was people find me through my podcast, then they join my email list, then they reach out after they get to know me a little and say, hey, how can I work with you? Right. So then that sort of began in 2022, and then I rebranded in November of 2022. In 2023, I went to an event, and there was a marketing team there, and they talked about how every person has a media personality. In other words, are you video? Are you audio? Are you writing? Are you live on stage? Those were kind of the audio personalities, or the personalities. And I was shocked through their quiz to discover that audio is my personality. And I was shocked, Chris, because I love video. Like, I'll get online and go live, no practice whatsoever, right? But it was audio. Well, then that started to make sense, because I was like, well, wait a minute. My podcast is part of my funnel. So let me put that higher up in my funnel, and let me make sure that not only am I giving a call to action specific to the content, but let me make sure that in my show notes, I'm mentioning, here's how you can get on my email list, or here's how you can work with me. I then started to include my own ad, if you will, that I placed between the end of the episode and my outro music and message. And so that ad changes. Sometimes it's about one-on-one coaching. Sometimes it's about my group coaching. Sometimes it's about my strategy day that I do. Because if I have 1,000 people downloading my podcast every month, which may not seem like a lot to people, but I feel like that's a lot, and I don't really worry about the numbers. Therefore, my podcast is pulling them in, and I need to tell them where to go. I need to tell them how to connect with me. So it is at the top of my funnel. And I know you kind of mentioned when we were talking before this about the idea of monetizing. So to me, I have monetized my podcast in that I have gained clients who pay me from my podcast. I don't have sponsors. I did have a short period of time that I had a sponsorship through an organization that I work with, Spark Media. And but I think it was bringing me like $32 a quarter. And I thought, ooh, I've monetized my podcast. But my point is, you have to really look at all of the ways that you're monetizing your podcast, not simply from ad revenue, but really, how is it bringing you to the right people? Or did your podcast bring you to a speaking opportunity, which then led to more clients, right? And that's how I really take a look at this as my main way of marketing, but also teaching.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Listen, there was so much insights that you just shared.
Sorry. Just go on.
No, that was so awesome. So awesome. So awesome. So everyone listening right now. So Erin just went over her entire funnel. Now
Right.
I think a lot of people just think about podcasting and specifically monetization. They think about ads that they can play, or sponsorships. They might want to get a sponsorship for a mattress company or BetterHelp or whatever, companies are out there having affiliate programs. But if you offer a service, you could sponsor yourself on your own podcast, which is what you're doing.
Exactly.
And you just went over your entire funnel. So what you shared, so your podcast is what you use to attract the wider audience, right? Mm-hmm. You go and you share your information about what you do, how you can help people, and you give insights on your podcast, and you give a call to action, right? I think on the last episode, you have like a 4 keys audio devotional, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That you can click here, download this, and then they get onto your mailing list. And then from there, if they know, as they continue to consume your content, they begin to know, like, and trust you, which is one of three key things that people need to have before they actually buy anything from you. And once they continue to consume your content, get on your mailing list, consume your content, then they say, hey, you know what? I want Erin to coach me. I'm going to set up a coaching appointment with her. And there you have a client. So what I just explained is exactly your funnel, your process. And I think everyone who has some sort of service out there, if you don't have a podcast yet, if you have a service business, but you don't have a podcast yet, you can use this same template that Erin is using in your business and see if you can get more clients and increase your revenue for your business using a podcast. Just a quick story. There is a friend that I have who is a real estate investor, and every day she's talking with either real estate agents or brokers and everything like that. And I'm trying to encourage her to get her to start a podcast because she needs to find clients to work with. And I'm saying to her, hey, if you start a podcast, these conversations that you're already having can turn into podcast episodes.
That's right.
And you can put that out there to attract more clients so that you can work with them.
That's right.
And again, so it's the same thing. And it's a template that a lot of people could follow if they have a service-based business.
Yeah. And I just want to add one thing to that, Chris.
Sure.
You've got to give it time.
Absolutely. Yes.
You know, you're not going to start a podcast next week and then suddenly you're going to have 50,000 people on your email list. And then suddenly, 10,000 of them are going to buy. No, please do not be fooled when people tell you that that's how it works.
Yes, that's right.
It's not.
Yeah, it takes time. But as you continue to consistently put out content, people will continue to listen and consume your content. Right. And the more content you have out there, the more chances you have of people will find it.
That's right.
And become a paying customer of yours, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it takes time. You just need to continue to put in the work. Now, one of the things that we need to do as if we're going to use that type of, for any type of podcast, we come to promotion. Right. Now, we talked about before when it comes to when we said hustling, putting things everywhere and blah, 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 and whatnot. Right. But when it comes to promotion, is there a lot of people use social media and different apps to promote their podcast, but is there a specific app or a specific way that you promote your podcast?
I would say to this point, until February of this year, because I made a little bit of a shift then. The biggest ways that I promoted my podcast were social media, mainly Instagram, LinkedIn, and my email list. And my email list gets notice of the podcast before anybody else. I mean, your email list, you are one with those people. You know, social media can go away anytime. And now all those people, you don't know where they are. And the other thing that I do is I repurpose my content from the podcast. So my social media is driven by my podcast content. So I'm constantly talking about it, right? Because if I'm going to record it once, why would I not use it over and over again?
Over and over, yes.
In February this year, I decided to start using YouTube. And the way that I do that, Chris, is I generally live stream almost all of my podcast episodes. So I use StreamYard to do that. I can record the episode and it streams live to it can go multiple places, but YouTube, LinkedIn, and my Facebook page is mainly where they go. And I met a woman who happens to be one of my recent guests, Tamara Bunty. And she said, you know what? I'm going to try this building out my YouTube. And I think you should do it for your podcast. And so I was already live streaming. So now I'm really using YouTube to promote my podcast. And the way that I'm doing that is, besides the live stream, I take that information and I put it into a platform that breaks it into little videos, right? Reels, or on YouTube, they call it shorts. Mm-hmm. And then I post a short. I posted a short every day for 90 days. And now I'm kind of doing it a little less frequently. But I'm able to not only post that short, but I'm also able to tag the related video. So I'm really utilizing that. What I've seen is my YouTube channel has grown from something like, I don't know, 30 subscribers maybe to 158 in that 90 days. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing is I'm never chasing the big numbers because God is my marketing plan. So,
I love that.
he tells me what to do, but that's really the best ways that I market it.
Wow. That's okay. So what you just shared is really, really practical insights of how podcasters can use YouTube to
Mhm.
attract an audience to listen to your podcast. And then the fact that you use shorts and you tag it to the full episode
Yep.
that you
Yep.
upload. Yeah. So I recently started using YouTube as well. Now, and I'll probably get into this in just a moment, but my biggest challenge right now is the creating the shorts and the additional short content.
Right.
But what you just shared and the consistency that you had over those 90 days, I think that played a big part
Oh, yeah.
in the increase that you've seen on your YouTube channel. So I think that's a really good takeaway for a lot of podcasters out there.
Yeah.
And I came to the realization that if you don't have some sort of video for your podcast, you need to get on that if you want your podcast to have a little bit more reach. Because I know I've realized that YouTube, through people that I've talked to, I realized that YouTube is a great tool to get reach and for people to find your podcasts. So
Right.
excellent insight that you shared on how to use YouTube or how you use YouTube to gain more listeners for your podcast. Now,
Yeah.
I briefly touched on challenges. Now, listen, if I had the ability to change one thing that you hate about
Mm.
podcasting, one of the biggest challenges that you had about podcasting, what would that be?
That's such a good question because I really do love it.
Everything about it?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the only thing that I don't love about it, but I have somebody that helps me do it, is getting it scheduled. Like, because I send it out, I send it to my editor sends me the file back, and then I host my podcast through Blueberry. That's the platform that I use. So I upload it to Blueberry, and then that connects to my WordPress. So then, I'm writing the post for the podcast. That is a little bit time consuming. However, I love to write. I I get my every episode transcribed, so I already have the words to be able to put into, the actual post. But I wouldn't say I hate that. To me, that's just part of the work that goes into having a podcast. Could I outsource somebody doing that writing for me? Probably.
Mm-hmm.
But I really love to write. So it would be hard for me to hand that over and trust that somebody could sound the way that my words would sound.
Mm-hmm.
I do wish it were a little more streamlined to be able to, get it scheduled and all of that. But I mean, it really takes me 15 minutes. So
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Now, you touched on something, and you didn't mention this before, but so you have a blog as well that your podcast is published on, right? So, in terms of like SEO,
Yeah.
I'm sure that this helped with people finding your podcast as well.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Because what I really do is, and I don't do it for every single episode, but I would say every couple of weeks, whatever that episode is, I take that podcast and what I've had transcribed, and then I turn it into a blog. But also know that pieces of that blog come from my email that I sent to my email list. Pieces of that blog get posted on social media. So I'm constantly repurposing that content.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, wonderful. Yeah, and I think that's key actually. If you want
Yeah.
to, if because there's so much things, one of the things that people say is their biggest challenges is finding time to do everything, right? But if you identify things that you can repurpose where
Yes.
you don't have to do the work over again, you can absolutely do that. So if
Yeah.
you record your podcast episode and transcribe it, and if you find a little section of the transcription, you can just take that and put it as the description for your
Exactly.
podcast on YouTube or on your description on the podcast hosting platform or wherever. So yeah, I think we need to find, as podcasters, you have to find out a way to be more efficient so that
Yes.
you can repurpose everything that you have already created and use that to your advantage. So
Exactly. And like you were saying earlier, right? You produce podcasts. Friends, if you're listening to this and you're editing your own podcast, like give it to Chris because I don't want to edit my podcast, and I have a great podcast editor. And if I had, I mean, at the beginning, I did piece all of those things together in GarageBand, right? But it is like worth gold to have somebody do that for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is my sweet spot. So I love editing. I will
Right.
spend hours, not that I need to, but I love going into the computer and editing audio. So
Yeah.
that's why I do it for other people. Now, you mentioned writing. You don't want to outsource the writing part of it because
Right.
from what you said, that is your sweet spot.
Yeah.
So if there's anyone listening right now and you're having a challenge editing your podcast, that's probably because it's not your sweet spot.
Right.
And if you want to love your podcast and, without the hassle, find someone else like me
Absolutely.
who can edit your
100%.
podcast for you, and love doing it and do a great job at it. And you can do the stuff that you love in your podcast, because that will actually fuel you. It will give you the energy
Yes.
to continue to do it because you've just outsourced the part that you didn't like. But now
That's
everything
right.
else that you love and gives you energy, you can
Yes.
continue to do those parts.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah. Yes, I got an amen on this podcast. Wonderful. Oh man, this has been so wonderful. So through the interview, Erin, you've given us you've dropped some tools and some software and some insight of the things that you use in order to produce your podcast. But can you walk us through the technical side of your podcast? So when it comes to
Sure.
hardware and software and things that you do to produce a podcast from end to end, can you walk us through that process?
Absolutely. Oh, so many tools that I use. So obviously I've upgraded my equipment, as you can see my microphone here. So I do use, I think it's called like the ATR 2100. I love this microphone. The sound is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And that piece I use, it plugs right into my laptop. I record my podcasts mostly on StreamYard. What I love about that is I can record locally because sometimes my Wi-Fi is a little wonky, so it preserves the recording. Sometimes I do use Zoom. It just depends on, what I'm doing and where I'm doing it. I use Blueberry as my podcast hosting platform, and I like that because it integrates with my WordPress website. Now, you talked a minute ago about outsource the things that you don't love, and I'm here to tell you that the back end of website stuff truly makes me want to puke. So, thankfully, I have somebody that's like taught me enough so I can do the writing, but Blueberry connects right to WordPress, so it makes it really seamless for me. So I use that.
Wonderful.
I use Canva to create images for the podcast, the blog, my reels, anything that goes along with the podcast. And I had an incredible graphic designer create my podcast cover, my blog tile, it's whatever those images are that matches my branding. So I use that. I organize my podcast topics and my content for my podcasts in Trello. So I use Trello a lot I have a Trello board specifically for my podcast. So I have each month I break down what that theme is, which goes back to my content and my SEO. And then I include in there any scriptures, any outbound links to books or blogs or whatever. So it's all in one place so that when it's time to write my show notes, I've already had it there. Or when it's time to record my podcast, I have that up on the screen side by side while I'm recording. And I'm trying to think what else. I don't use headphones. I mean, I have headphones, but I find that this microphone is so good that it really blocks out all of the background noise and any sort of like ambient noise that's around. So that's been really helpful for me to have that. So WeTransfer is how I get the actual episode video over to my podcast editor because it's easy to send larger
Yes.
files that way. And then I use Cast Magic to transcribe. So what I do is as soon as I record it, I probably could use Cast Magic while I'm recording it, but I just don't think about that way. I drop it into Cast Magic and it transcribes it, but it also gives me like title suggestions and highlight suggestions. It can write a blog for me if I want. It can write a LinkedIn post for me. It can use AI to give me other things and keywords. And so lots of ways that Cast Magic works. And then I use something called video. It's VIDYO.ai to create my shorts. So I put my video in there, it breaks it into shorts, and then I like to edit it myself because I like to use a certain font and certain colors and that kind of thing. So I would say that Trello, WeTransfer, and video.ai, I use the free versions. Cast Magic I paid for, Blueberry I paid for. Yeah. So, and StreamYard I pay for.
Okay. Yeah. So that's awesome. So a lot of those tools that you mentioned, a lot of other podcasters use them as well. So they're fairly popular. I don't think there's much people who don't know about them, but if you are hearing about them for the first time, you can just do some research on them. And like you said, there's a lot of free versions. So what I have for all of my listeners right now is I have a cheat sheet that I've created for all podcasters. And I have a list of resources, software and hardware that if you're starting a podcast or just new to podcasting and you want to get better at it, and some of these tools that you mentioned, I have them on that cheat sheet. So if anyone listening out there wants to get a hold of this list that I have, and I update it regularly, you can just get it from the link in the description, and you can start using some of those apps because, like you mentioned, a lot of them are free. So you can start getting the benefit from these apps without paying a dime, right? And if you need to invest a little bit more money into it, you can do that after you tried it and get used to it and see the benefit from it, right?
Yeah.
So Erin, this has been so awesome. I've learned a lot from this conversation. And like I said before, I listen to your podcast a lot. So is there anything that I may have forgotten to ask you that you want to share, or one final piece of insight that you want to share with anyone about podcasting?
The final piece of insight that I would share is think of podcasting as one more way to put your message in the world that can do the work of reaching broader audiences while you're doing other things, because you don't know who's downloading that, right? You don't know when they're downloading it. I mean, they may be listening to it in the middle of the night, who knows? But it is such a great way to expand your audience and expand your message. And please do not be scared off that there are so many podcasts out there. There are people who need to hear from you that can't hear that message from someone else. But I love that you have that cheat sheet, Chris. So everybody go get the cheat sheet, because don't let those things stop you from putting your message into the world. Somebody is waiting for you to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Erin, thank you so much. And I love what you just said. There are a lot of podcasts out there, but there's only one you.
That's right.
You have a message that can help someone else out there. So go ahead and start your podcast. Erin, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, great interview. And I'm going to encourage everybody now to listen to your podcast. I place links for it in the description, and they can connect with you on YouTube, on Instagram, LinkedIn, and any other socials. Check the description for all of the links and connect with Erin, and you can listen to her podcast. So anyone, if you want to learn some insights with regards to your business and how you can get some biblical principles for success for your business, I would encourage you to listen to Erin's podcast. It will help you get to the next level. So Erin, thank you so much for being on I Made a Podcast. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
And that's it. That was a wonderful episode with Erin. It was totally full of so much insight, and I hope that you learned a lot through what we talked about today. Now, remember, I put links for all of Erin's social media and her podcast and any way that you can connect with her. It's in the description, so you can go down there and click on those links and get connected with Erin to hear more of the goodness that she is talking about on her podcast. And as I said before, I have a cheat sheet in the description of this episode because I want you to start your podcast and I want it to sound amazing. So go check the cheat sheet. It's in the description. You can get a list of all of the resources that you need to have to start a podcast and have it sounding amazing. Now, remember, this podcast is available on all of the major podcasting apps. Just search I Made a Podcast. You can subscribe on any one of those apps. And if you find the podcast on any one of those apps, write a review, put a 5-star rating, and tell the world why this podcast is one of the best podcasts in the world. and I am grateful if you could do that. Now, as I always say, the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. So go ahead and make it happen. And you'll hear from me next week on I Made a Podcast. Peace.